This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Khalil Saucier, who teaches in the Department of Critical Black Studies at Bucknell University. Along with a number of scholarly articles and short pieces, he is the author of Necessarily Black, Cape Verdean Youth, Hip-Hop Culture, and a Critique of Identity from 2015, co-author of African Migrants, European Borders, and the Problem with Humanitarianism from 2024, and has done editorial work producing important volumes, which include most recently A Luta Continua, Reintroducing Amilcar Cabral to a New Generation of Thinkers from 2016, Conceptual Aphasia in Black, Displacing Racial Formation Theory, also 2016, and The Black Mediterranean, Bodies, Borders, and Citizenship from 2021. In this conversation, we discuss transnational study and the Black Studies imagination, the political significance of the study of Black life, and the transformation of disciplines when put in contact with Black Studies sensibilities. Hello, Khalil. How are you today?
Doing well. Thanks for having me, John.
Well, welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. I'm really happy we had time. We found time to talk today. This is, by the way, my first podcast for the series of 2025. So
Nice.
It's nice to get back in the groove of conversations. Really looking forward to this. I know there's a lot for us to talk about. I'm really interested to hear your perspective on the field, sort of how you got into it, how you think about your research in relation to Black studies. And I know, and I'm sure this will come up, that you were a founding figure in your department in terms of setting up a critical Black studies department. So I'm really interested in many ways to hear about what you have to say. I think that the work you do is super interesting, and also this mixture of research and also institution building is just so important. So thank you for making the time, and I look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, again, thanks for having me, John. Really appreciate the invitation. I should say, I want to echo what I know. I haven't listened to every podcast you've done, but definitely what you're doing is important. It's historically important for building this kind of emergent archive. And I would also say pedagogically really rich and informative. You know, as I'm thinking about doing my Intro to Black Studies course this spring, I can see how this podcast is really going to fit in because it really shows the kind of expansiveness of thought in this field and discipline. So thank you to you and Ashley. So
I really appreciate that. I mean, I have to say, Ashley and I talked about it in our end of year 2024 podcast. We both have just learned so much about the field by listening to other people talk about it and shifted our own understandings. And that's actually one of our real hopes. So I deeply appreciate it, is that not only do we as scholars have an encounter with our field and thinking about our field, but also see it have this podcast is having a place in classrooms. So I'll pass that on to her. That's really nice to hear. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I think you've made our work a little more difficult now that I have to, who should we listen to or not? But thank you to you both.
Well, I work hard to try to make the audio sound good, so at least you're puzzling through the different episodes will sound good. All right, so let me get started. I wanted to, obviously we'll talk about the field, your vision of it, your research, but I wanted to start really with a more intimate or personal question, which is just to invite you to narrate a bit for us how you got into Black studies, what drew you to the study of Black life, and for me, always this really interesting question, what sustains you in relation to both?
I mean, fantastic question. Really makes me have to go back to my teenage years, really, to think about this. If I was to kind of just generally answer this question, I would say I got into Black studies through a kind of communal invitation where members of my community exchanged, deeply impactful resources to me. And I guess I just said invitation. Maybe I should actually probably say intervention. I was a kind of hot-headed teenager. I was a basketball player. And when I think back about my formative years in connection to Black studies or my interest in Black studies, there was a small constellation of books that, I don't know, kind of served as a plowshare, if you will, to create some space so I can, begin to think differently about the world. And I can always recall when I received those books, where I received those books, who gave them to me, etc. And I would say that my interest in Black studies starts when I was 16. I was on the basketball court in my town, my city, and I was given Ivan von Sertima's They Came Before Columbus. And it was a little odd gesture. I'm on a basketball court, it's summer, and this older mentor of mine gives me this book. Had nothing to do with basketball. And I started to look through it, and if you know anything about do you know anything about that book?
Yeah.
Yeah, it has pictures in it, which is fairly uncommon nowadays for academic texts. And I'm like, what are these? Like, what is this? And I think it was the first book I read from front to back. I was so intrigued first by the pictures, by the gesture, and that just started a kind of force within me. It created a set of questions, a new framework. And then I think it was like several months later, I was at the barbershop and I'm telling my barber about it. And he's like, yeah, I've heard of it. Have you heard of, Carter G. Woodson's The Miseducation of the Negro? And I'm like, no, I haven't. So he mentions that, and he was also a member of the Nation of Islam at the time. And he also mentions this book, a really, I would say, undervalued book by Essian Udom, titled Black Nationalism, A Search for an Identity. And it was an ethnography on the Nation of Islam. So I could see why he was interested in it. But he tells me about these two things. It's still summertime. I'm somewhat interested, but I'm not going to the public library. But I return to the barbershop and he has them in hand. And then these two things become the second and third books I read from front to back. And they just, again, they really changed the way in which I was looking at stuff. And I remember going back into school, high school, and using these books as a kind of referential frame to ask questions in social studies and in history class. Got me in a lot of trouble. I was kind of like that, what Bayard Rustin calls an angelic troublemaker, largely because of these three texts, which I see as foundational to Black studies in many ways, even though Essian Udom's book is a little kind of off the beaten path, unless you're very, very specific into Black religion and things of that nature. And so at that time, too, with these questions, there was a teaching assistant in my history class, and she saw what I was doing, and I was getting in trouble. I actually got kicked out of history class, all these types of things, for asking all these questions and for what I was trying to write. I said trying because I couldn't really write in high school. And she suggests to me, why don't you start an African American Studies Club? I'm like, I don't know what that means. I never heard of African American Studies. And as a sophomore, late sophomore, I started this club, got some money from the principal, and it was me and, friends, and this TA would stick around. I think it was on Tuesdays, if I recall, and just hang out. But we had some money. I think the first thing we did, unfortunately, was go see New Jack City when it came out. But so these moments are really what drew me into what I now understand as the field. I didn't know that a field existed at that time until this TA suggested African American studies, and then it kind of went dormant for a little bit. And I bounced around to a couple colleges and universities. Eventually, I settled at one in my home state and home city, and that the kind of interest came back. And a professor of mine gave me Amilcar Cabral's Return to the Source. He's like, I see you're interested in Marxism. Why don't we try to stretch that? And I was also taking a class on Black history where we read Robin D.G. Kelly's Hammer and Hoe. And that semester in particular, Robin Kelly also gave a lecture at a neighboring institution, which I attended. And I was just really smitten, not only by his work, but also his kind of performance of self. I was like, oh, being a professor looks cool in these types of things in some ways. So it's really, a lot of these books really set the stage for my interest in it. And they changed really everything for me. The way, I understand history, or was understanding history at that time. When I think of Carter Woodson's book, The Failure of Education, in this sense, Udon's book really put me on the path, or interest in ethnography, and Cabral and Kelly's book, really put me in the kind of the realm of political theory more generally. So they really, I think, if I put it all together, those texts and the people that gave them to me, and the small communities that I was with at that time, really helped formulate, I think, the art of understanding purpose and action, right? And purpose and action, both, I don't know, maybe I'll take some insight from someone who's close to you, Professor Greg Carr at Howard, where he understands this idea of verticality and thinking horizontally as well. And that understanding purpose and action vertically and horizontally for me is being present vertically. These books allowed me to be present vertically, bringing a kind of long view awareness to historical events and genealogies, and being present horizontally, as Carr would state, cultivating a kind of awareness of how contemporary events affect action today. So, I mean, really, that's the beginning of my journey. Those books, those community members, and then it just kind of continued from there as I continued to stay in school and pursue degrees and in education. I went on, I got a master's in Africana Studies as my next move after my BA, where I double majored in what was called African Diaspora Studies and also sociology as well. So
I love this. I mean, I say it often in these conversations. This is like my favorite question, just because people's journeys just are all over the place. You never know. Sometimes it's the parents had a very, sort of Black studies sort of household and sort of came to it through there. Sometimes it's a class. Sometimes it's a, mid-career discovery. I love this, just the sheer chance of that, and you use the word present. And I was thinking that as I was listening to you, like, it's a reminder to me of all the ways that we are present to students and people in our neighborhood and just random encounters. And like, you never know what's that thing that shifts the meaning of somebody's life, right? In terms of self-insight, curiosity, passion. And I just was really struck by, that part where you said, this was the first book I read cover to cover. I mean, that's not an insignificant thing. I mean, that's a sense of accomplishment. That's a sense of like I'm really engaged with something. It's a sense of being a sort of worthy conversationalist with this event that a book is. Absolutely love that. I love that they were these books too. I mean, that's, it wasn't out of a movie about Black studies where it's like, I got Souls of Black Folk, and then I got, Prophecy Deliverance or something. I mean, these are books that clearly meant something very intimate to the people, and that giving to you on a basketball court, at a barber shop, is a reminder of how Black studies and sort of everydayness or vernacular life is so intimate, right? Even so, your own sort of origins really sort of embody that in such a fascinating way.
Yeah. I think in some ways I like what Fred Moten sometimes says, or has said in certain areas in his scholarship, that Black studies is a gift in many ways, and it's definitely been an important gift to me, and I'm always trying to give back as well, like my mentors in the past have done. So
I have a shelf of all my double books, try to make students take them. You never know what takes off.
true.
Sometimes I wonder if I give somebody a book and it's right back on the resale shelf. But you never know, Wretched of the Earth has been known to change a life or two. So, well, let me ask you about the field of Black studies. I mean, and in some ways you've already started an answer to this, but I want to get inside your imagination of the field. Like, what is this picture of the field that you work with? I want to ask specifically in terms of its origin, right? As a part of our institutional lives, which is coming at that moment where Black students and faculty, but Black students really demanded the study of Black life, something that disciplines on campuses had failed to do. And that Black studies was going to be this place where Black life was going to be studied, produced and reproduced as an intellectual pursuit. But it also comes at that time, of course, where the civil rights movement has transformed into more radicalized forms of liberation struggle, where the boundaries between the campus and the community, between the classroom and liberation struggle had really collapsed. And so it had that political demand, right? That demand to actually prescribe and intervene at the level of Black liberation struggle. And that builds, a bit of a tension, right? How we think about it as a tension, I think, is really interesting. But into the origins of Black studies, the question of intellectual traditions and study, and Black liberation struggle that's about material transformation. And so I think we've carried that with us through the 50-something years of Black studies at every level. And so for me, it's interesting in 2025 now to ask, so revisit that question and ask, so I'm asking you, how do you see the field of Black studies specifically in relationship to this tension between liberation struggle as a material question and the pursuit of an intellectual life and the development of that tradition?
Yeah, I think that tension is not, it's a productive tension at the very least. And I think they're one and the same. They're part of the same kind of project in general. I like to call it a project. A lot of people call it Black Studies project. I think Black Studies is a critical invitation to another world, what, Du Bois would call for a bright tomorrow, right? And so I think that tension that we typically see between the political and the intellectual really is just part of that general structural invitation, right? It needs to be there in the first place. I also understand, I'm down for Cedric Robinson's definition of what Black studies is and so many others, but it's definitely not just the practice of negation as I understand it. What I like to mobilize when thinking about this is Vincent Harding's idea that, Black studies is not just dark copies of a dying whiteness, for instance, right? And, if I think back to those books that I just mentioned, for instance, that the formative years of my intellectual development, I think these books, warts and all, because they all have problems with them, really exhibit the way I understand Black studies as a project, which is to say they really exhibit what you can see. I'm kind of really enamored with Black studies in its original thrust because I'm about to throw out Lerone Bennett here. I really love Lerone Bennett's essay, The Challenge of Blackness, right? And so I think Black studies is an illustration of what Bennett outlines and articulates in that really important essay, right? First, I think what he shows and what I take Black studies to be is it's a result of certain modes of social organization, right? Particularly generated by Black diasporans, generated through a kind of collective experience and forms of inhabitation that kind of create a collective effervescence, if you will. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the first thing that I see in Black studies, or how I understand it. It is this kind of result of a kind of just thinking together. I think second, Black Studies is a storehouse for basic tools, but they're new tools. It's new bibliographies, it's new archives that are required to do the deep work for changing the world. Third, I would say Black Studies helps develop new concepts, new frames, new references that transcends Western discourse, right? It unhinges from normative power. I don't know how many people on this podcast have said this before. It allows you to be undisciplined, right? In many ways. And being undisciplined allows you to change the modes and methods that you used when you do research, when you teach. It gives you different ways, new ways, innovative ways in entering and leaving the archives of slavery, of entering and leaving the archives of colonialism, popular culture, so forth and so on. Connected to that, to kind of continue with Lerone Bennett's ideas there, is I would say fourth is Black Studies in its own way illustrates, knowledge as action, right? It's not just mere contemplation. And so I think that's where that tension really comes out after you hone, the basic tools, after you acquire those tools, after you learn new conceptual frameworks, so forth and so on, that you can put history, right, into action, becomes a source of service. It's just not a subject. Or so it's used to do something else with. And so what I think that also does in turn is it brings a tension between struggle and scholarship, kind of like connected to the third point that I was making, classroom, street, culture and politics, and even I would say mind and body for the most part when we see that split, that bifurcation. And I think finally, for me, Black Studies is really, and I kind of already said this in a way, it's a way, after acquiring those tools, those frameworks, after putting it into action, it means to generate and create another world, right? So I embrace the kind of original idea of Black Studies. My idea is kind of inseparable from that original thrust, as Sylvia Winters would call it, where it's intimately tied and guided by a quest for freedom and liberation, right? Or if I was to bring back Bennett here for a minute and pair him with like Du Bois, for instance, I would say that Black Studies for me is structured around the idea that education is service. So again, bringing those tensions into a relationship, if you will. So, I mean, that's kind of how I see the tension. That's how I understand Black Studies in general, as a kind of framework rather than simply theoretical, philosophical dispositions, in some ways.
And I like that, you use that word relation, bringing these tensions into relation, because tensions can be that sort of, are you sort of prescriptive or a descriptive, intellectual or actor in relation to the field of Black Studies. But that question of relation, as you kept articulating it, makes all of these things so different. As well as, and I've said this in a few podcasts, it is 2025, and I'm not even sure that just saying Black Studies isn't going to become its own kind of political act. I mean, if it's not already, in the sense of our field is about to be tested in terms of its future, right? And so maybe some of the comfort that I had even just like 3 or 4 years ago around the idea that the intellectualist side of Black Studies had a sort of security to it, or could be accused of being divorced from politics, is already a question. But I also was really thinking, as you were talking, you alluded to it as well, the books that you were given right on the basketball court and in the barber shop are intellectual books, but they're not given to you in those moments in a detached from community places, right? In fact, those are as community of places as you can get, a barbershop and a neighborhood court. So I love this idea of relation and what happens in those points of contact. That's really wonderfully put.
I think if I could just say something else in reference to this, I think that relationship there between, say, the basketball court and the text, for instance, or the barbershop, etc. I like this kind of new distinction that we're seeing in Black studies between Black studies and Black study, because I think it allows for us to see that kind of longue durée of study without its institutional formation. And it allows us to actually kind of focus and index a little bit more that while I think you and I and many others probably listening to this want Black studies to persist in the academy for many reasons, it doesn't necessarily need the academy.
Yeah.
In many ways. So.
Yeah. And, I think that relationship, as you said, the sort of emerging conversation about Black studies and Black study and the way Black study exceeds, to put it lightly, exceeds the classroom. But also, what is that relationship? I mean, hearing you talk, I'm also thinking about, a previous podcast with Ed Pavlich, where he was saying, his first encounter with Black studies was an African-American literature course where he didn't know anything about literature or African-American literature, but the professor came in and put a boombox, aging us, but put a boombox on the desk, on the table in front of the classroom and said, I don't see a distinction between literature and music, so we start here. And Ed in that podcast says, I knew music, so now I had a way in. Now I had a connection and a relation. And it's that relation that's not manufactured, but indigenous to the thing that's happening in Black studies. I think that's always going to be a struggle, right? To keep that connection, just because institutions do their work on us, but it's an imperative. And so I'm happy to hear it sort of come back in this conversation. Thank you for that. Well, let me ask you about your own work. You work in a sort of interesting mix of social and historical scientific methods, political theory, deep engagement with contemporary issues of migration, which, across the Atlantic and Mediterranean world are just so immensely important. And there's just a lot of insights that you get from this mixture of methods and areas of interest. And I'm curious, when you reflect on your own work in relation to Black studies, how do you see it relating to the tradition of Black studies, to the past of the field? But also, how do you see your research opening up new or different horizons?
Yeah, another great question. I think in my understanding of Black studies, where it requires you to look at knowledge production, policies, institutions in different ways, requires you to reevaluate everything we're doing, what we're saying, what we're writing, etc. That's always at the forefront of what I'm trying to do, whether it's on migration across the Mediterranean, whether it's on hip hop. More recently, I've gotten into looking at the interconnections between Blackness and the sport of cycling, or sports more generally. Those are always there. And so what that always requires, because I have that Black studies frame, is kind of tarrying and wallowing with the conceptual lenses of these more traditional disciplines that take up these themes, these topics, these interests. So that's always at the forefront. So if you look at my ethnographic work, it often offers a kind of contrapuntal reading of this, I'll call it a tension now, between Fanon's idea of the lived experience and the often said mistranslated fact of Blackness. And I actually like, for me as an ethnographer over the years, to use that particular tension of the two, and what will that do with ethnographic work? So I'm always trying to read those two things together when I'm, say, out in the field, so to speak. So,
but by the way, just sorry to interrupt, but I have to say that's one of the best mistranslations ever, the fact of Blackness. I totally agree with you. I regularly kind of wish it was the fact of Blackness, but yeah, but it's not. It's expérience vécue.
Yeah, and I totally, years ago, I got into that, well, no, we got to be correct. And then when I really started to do ethnographic work, I said, there's something productive in this, I think.
Yeah.
So really, a lot of my research does explore the lived experience and the facticity of that correlation of the two. So when you look at, one of my books early on, Necessarily Black, where I look at Cape Verdean youth who, with all your years in New England, probably a thing or two about some Cape Verdeans living up in the Northeast.
Yeah.
Well, when they narrated the lived experience with me over the years that I did the so-called deep hanging out, right? That does more than just simply illustrate and extend identitarian complexity, broaden the scope of Black identity. Yeah, I think it's simultaneously, as I was trying to do in that book, particularly with the title, Necessarily Black, that it also helps make legible the structure of whether you like white supremacy or anti-Blackness. It makes legible that type of stuff, which requires the necessity of Blackness in general. But, I can't always do ethnographic work. So Black studies theoretically and philosophically has always been in my ethnographic wheelhouse, but I think deep down inside I always wanted to be a theoretician, but I didn't think I was smart enough to be one, so I always stayed away from it. But given that ethnographic work is costly,
a theorist, I appreciate the flattery.
Oh no, seriously, I still don't think I have the chops to do theoretical work, but I'm like, why not? Because ethnographic work can be expensive if you don't get funded. So I think my theoretical work now, like a lot of my stuff on, say, African migration with Tryon Woods in particular, really tries to show the limitations of certain intellectual traditions like migration studies, or even critical migration studies, or even subfields like Black Mediterranean studies, for instance. These things. And I think a lot of my projects use Black studies in order to kind of gesture a kind of a structure for radical questioning, which I think often grates against all the kind of certainties that disciplines typically communicate to students and scholars. It's I would say my theoretical work, along with the ethnographic, because it's deeply informed, I think refuses to think in disciplinary ways. I think that's where, Black studies for me really comes in, that I'm not going to speak through a single discipline. I have a preference for a kind of, methodological and theoretical detachment, which I think is Black studies informed. That is Black studies, which then in turn, if you have that detachment, you're often more willing to kind of reject the hegemony of disciplinary methods. Being a PhD in anthropology and sociology, I had a kind of traditional education, but it allowed me to throw those things off. I think also, too, much of my work, whether it's theoretical, whether it's, again, hip hop or migration or meditations on ethnography, for instance, is always in tension with the scholasticism of today. Excuse me. Take, for instance, things like, decolonize the humanities. If we look closely, I think more often these are not efforts or modes of refusal, right? But I think more so they're expressions of resistance to so-called the Eurocentric character of academic fields. And I think that's important, but I actually don't think, again, that's Black studies. So I'm always trying to do my work within that vein. I'm not just simply trying to create things where it's a practice of recognition or incorporation, right? It's really always an attempt to kind of breach the barriers of what's commonly used in the discipline, what's commonly practiced, if you will. And I think, I don't know, if I think about it in like another way, thinking that, all your work on the Caribbean and stuff like that, I think similar to that motley crew illustrated by C.L.R. James, long ago, I think my work taken together is engaged in a kind of subversive project to confront, the immense power of normative ideas, right? Guided by, forms of intelligibility that lay outside constituent power, if you will. And so those things are always there. So I think when people read my work, whether it's an essay, whether it's a co-authored piece, I do a lot of co-authored stuff because I like doing things together. Again, I think that's central to Black studies. If I'm not, or we're not unnerving you, I don't think we're doing our job, right? And it's nothing personal, but I think that's the point, is to create that counterpoint to Western modernity, right? Using those basic tools that I mentioned earlier, those frames and other things.
I love that. And as a follow-up, I mean, in some ways you've already answered this question. I'm curious because I really like the way you articulated that, the relationship between Black studies and your own sociological and anthropological background. I know it's primarily sociological. That tension between Black studies as an area studies, as anti, multi, however you want to call it, disciplinary, and a discipline. And so, having been trained in a discipline and working outside of a discipline, you said a decent amount about how that's impacted your research and made your research different. And so anything else you want to add would be interesting. But I'm also interested in hearing you reflect a little bit on how that movement between the discipline and then Black studies has impacted the way you think about a classroom.
This is a great question, because my first job, I was not in a Black studies or Africana studies department or program. I was assistant professor of sociology and justice studies. Because of my PhD in sociology, I had a focus on sociology of race. So I was required, because of my expertise, to teach sociology of race and anything to do with the justice system, even though I didn't do any of that stuff in university.
Oh, they meant justice like justice system, not like justice like...
Yeah, no, justice system.
Like reckoning with history or something. Okay.
No, it was the, the new way of thinking about criminology, right? And so they said, oh, you do race. Can you do our, I forget the name of it, but it was like a race and justice course, justice studies course, race and criminology, race and incarceration. And I'm like, new PhD, I don't have that stuff behind me, but it's a job, right?
Yeah. By the way, this is only audio. I wish we had the video as you're recounting this moment. I have a similar kind of first job experience now, but I know this feeling.
So to your question, the thing that I could fall back on to think about prisons, incarceration, the police, etc., I'm thinking Black Power by Kwame Ture. I'm thinking Blood in My Eye, George Jackson, Assata Shakur. So they're going to be my foundation. So all that to say is, in entering the classroom, traditional classrooms, meaning traditional disciplinary classrooms, for me, they were already Black studies courses. I often would on my syllabi, it would say, whatever sociology course it was. And then I would generate some kind of Black studies idea. And this is what we're going to do. So I've never taught classes, sociological classes or anthropological classes, in the traditional vein. They've always been founded on a Black studies corpus. So when I would teach intro to sociology, for instance, many moons ago, I would use Joyce Ladner's The Death of White Sociology, right, as foundational to the intro to sociology. So it's always been where Black studies serves as the foundation first and foremost. I think it's really because I was a reluctant sociologist in general. I didn't get a PhD in sociology because I liked sociology so much. It just had some things about it that I was attracted to as an undergraduate, but it was also for me convenient at that time to get a PhD in sociology as opposed to a history degree or an African American studies degree, et cetera. So I think that reluctance created this kind of no allegiances, and no one's going to know what I'm doing in the classroom anyways. And if Joyce Ladner can put, certain types of scholars in her text to disrupt sociological jargon and concepts, then I can also do it as well. So Black Studies has always been foundational, even when, I was teaching more traditional classes. And now I find myself, in order to create that connection with students, because they are so disciplined, if you will, using more disciplinary readings and insights in order to at least illustrate the insights of what Black Studies is able to do. So it's kind of reversed for me nowadays a little bit more, but I think it's really because of where students are and what those access points are pedagogically. So,
yeah, super interesting. I mean, I think what a Black Studies classroom is, what it makes possible, how to be responsive to the idea of Black Studies and how we construct a syllabus, but also how we conduct conversation, how we orient conversation is such a fascinating question. And especially for those of us who came to Black Studies through a discipline, right? As much as we may say, not may say, but may act in this sort of it's already Black Studies in some way, that wrestling with the disciplinary dimension, I think, is really interesting. And for me, and I hear a lot of echoes in what you just said, a lot of what you were saying about relation, right, between, politics and intellectual life, like these tensions and what did they produce, but also putting that Black Studies frame first. And that little secret, I don't know that I've said it to any graduate students I've taught, but, nobody really knows what you do in that classroom. You turn in that syllabus, that goes to the ADC and goes right in a file, or the director of undergraduate studies who makes sure you have the, what is it called? The learning outcomes at some point. And otherwise, go do your thing. And I think it's important, right? I mean, that's the freedom of teaching. It's where we become singular as professors, but it's also where the sort of subversiveness of Black Studies can really do a lot of work. I like that.
But I think that's also, too, where, we can see where, I know we hate to do this sometimes as Black Studies scholars, see how Black Studies can help at least modulate and regulate what the other disciplines do, at least right now, right? In the sense that Black Studies can help make them better and garner more insights rather than just doing, a kind of add or subtract type of thing to their syllabi. Like sociology often just does, okay, we need to deal with race from Black Studies, let's just add Du Bois. But it's not even actually dealing with Du Bois. It's more biographical than anything. Yeah. So I think it can help these disciplines at least become a little more robust in the meantime, in between time, if you will.
And that's for me, that's part of meeting students where they are. Yeah, they might be sociology majors. They might be film and media studies majors who are taking a course I'm teaching on Black Atlantic cinema and like, what is a Black Studies aesthetic? What is a Black Studies approach to the study of social life, right? These are also moments where they take that to those other classrooms. They become like you in high school, like pissing people off, but in all good ways. And not to make this about me, but one of my favorite moments in a previous job at Assumption College. So if I have any Assumption students from that class listening, they'll remember it. I taught a class on race and the Enlightenment. And they went back to their seminars on Kant and Hegel and so forth, saying, wait a minute, so you're not going to talk about this racist motherfucker's writings? But I love that. I got a lot of complaints from my colleagues, and I was like, keep complaining. It's in the book. I'm not making stuff up. So let me ask you a sort of big speculative question about past 5+ decades of Black Studies. What do you think Black Studies has done well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
I'll start with the well. even though maybe I should end on a positive with that. But I think on the one hand, what is done tremendously well is exploding. Maybe I'll use Louis Ricardo Gordon's insights here, and exploding the kind of decadence of disciplines, right? The decadence of disciplinary formations in general. It's done really well in working through the contradictions of certain modes of thought, modes of being, etc., and has also helped develop, as I was kind of alluding to and saying before, alternative conceptions of reality in many ways. So I think it's done that really well in a general sense. I guess we could talk about the nuance, but I think Black Studies is so heterodox. There's just so many ways in which that it has, really kind of undisciplined disciplinary thinking. Again, shout out to Louis Gordon there. I think on the other hand, for me, I don't think it's done a very great job, particularly as of late, in dealing with, we'll say, the dastardly forces of co-option. You kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier on what institutions do. And I think there's been a lack of attention concerning the autonomy of the discipline, particularly within institutional formations. And I think that waning of autonomy has created, in some sense, a crisis in political education, to kind of go back to one of your early questions as well. I think it's done that. So I see a lot of, Robin Kelley, actually, thinking of Robin Kelley's, I think, great piece, because I'm thinking about my Intro to Black Studies course now, his great piece in the Boston Review, like 4 years ago, maybe, Black Studies, Black Struggle, where he makes this argument that, political education is in crisis, because what it's done is it's actually put all its eggs in the basket of psychic transformation as opposed to total transformation. So we see the language of institutional forms, trickling down into the ways in which we think about white supremacy, anti-Blackness, Black life. And so a lot of what Black Studies has now become in some ways is about, cultural competency, triggers, microaggressions. And these are the things that Kelley details in that essay, I think, rather well. So we haven't paid enough attention to that spirit of Black Studies that is about total transformation, right? And I think now what has happened through a myriad of reasons is that in that inattentiveness, now Black Studies is really for the academy in some ways, or in many places, where I think before it was, it's the saying, it's in, but it's not of or for the academy. But I think that has kind of changed a little bit depending on where you're looking, what department, what program, what center you're looking at, what scholars you're reading, etc. So I think we need to attend to that a little bit more, because it's easy to get duped a little bit by some of these things,
Yeah, and I think in 2025, with the, coming into power of a far-right government, thinking about, what does it mean to have perceived our own safety and our own comfort and our own belonging is about to be a forced reckoning, like whether we want to or not. But also, to your point, it's going to expose, this question, how much have we thought about it, and what does it mean to have not thought about it, to have lost a little bit of that? No, I really love that. Really important thread of this conversation, and a really important frame for all of us in the next handful of years, for sure. Let me ask a more future-oriented, very speculative question. We've talked a bit about, about the disciplines and Black Studies. I absolutely think the impact of Black Studies on disciplines has been massive. I think, especially as a humanist, that history and English departments, gender studies departments, not really a discipline, but other area studies have been really transformed by Black studies. I think like English and history departments, Black history, Black literature is just so central to those departments for the most part. And so I think about, the creeping impact on other disciplines. And it makes me wonder, looking, and this is really kind of a futurist, almost like a fantasy moment, but what would be a sign in the future of the ultimate success of Black studies? Would it be that moment where the disciplines have been so transformed by our field that the study of Black life is everywhere in full substantial ways? Or is there something singular about Black studies after 50-something years that actually is not digestible by any kind of radicalized vision of transformed disciplines, right? In other words, has Black studies become something that is irreplaceable? And is it moving in that direction? Or is the ultimate success of Black studies to really dissolve itself?
Yeah, this is a politically loaded question and loaded intellectually as well, to kind of go back to your earlier insights and questions, I think. I think in general, when I think about or imagine Black studies, now that we're 50 years in and more, is that one, I think Black studies has always been under attack, right? Whether it's in its institutional formation or even pre-formation. I think go back to Carter G. Woodson, when Woodson is trying to start his Journal of Negro Education. I don't think it was an easy time for him to get that off the ground. So, Black studies has always been under attack in many ways in this sense. And I think even when you have the birth of these departments, these centers, and these programs in the 70s, they come into existence, but there's a constant struggle and there's a battle. There's a battle for departmental status. And then I think also, too, when you look at it, what do you have? Over 500 departments, centers, and programs in the early 70s, and you're down a few hundred 5-6 years later because of defunding and these types of things. So the reason why I'm kind of saying that in answering your question in some ways, I think that Black studies has always been on the offensive. It will always be on the offensive. It will always struggle. I think today the struggling is a little more complicated and covert in some ways, which I think unfortunately is starting and has started to gut the intellectual and political content of Black studies, referring back to, say, that the Kelly article that I mentioned and these types of things, that the growth or the indispensability of Black studies on many college campuses and university campuses is really not a reflection of administrative response, but more so administrative reaction. And that reaction is, just really kind of caught up in affect, feeling, containment, and a whole bunch of other things. So I think if the world continues as such, Black studies will always continue to be under attack. And I think that, yeah, I mean, I'm really kind of bumfuzzled by your question here. The more I think about it is that, yeah, I think it will always be under attack. I think when there is no need for a Black studies in a more honest and sincere way, to kind of go back to your question, then I think we have done our work in some ways. I think that kind of echoes in some ways Frank Wilderson's concept of some things and in many others. But I think when we're unemployed, then the overall objective of liberation and freedom for people, that will be the signal. But it can't come because of some ideological war. It's because we've done our due diligence, So I know that is a bad answer, but
I don't think it's a bad answer. Yeah. It's funny you came back to actually one of the sources for when Ashley and I were talking about these questions when we were formulating the podcast. For me, this question comes from Richard Wright essay on the literature of the American Negro. right? One of his earlier nonfiction pieces. And in that, he concludes and he says, people ask, when will I stop writing about race? Or when will African-American writers stop writing about race? And he says, well, when you stop, attacking us, right? In other words, when racism is over, you won't have literature about blackness. And I took that really, maybe it's Richard Wright, so of course he's sneering about it. He's like, you all are never going to stop. And I think he has an insight. I mean, he's one of these people, I think, who thinks what we would now call anti-blackness is metaphysical. It's just built into our reality. That's his deep pessimism. But he indicated for me the sort of question, what would be the sign of the end of Black studies? Would be the end of anti-Black racism. How is that imaginable? But also, all these decades of working in Black studies, is there something like a Black studies methodology that survives even this sort of imagination of an almost apocalyptic event, apocalyptic for white supremacy, but sort of end of the world as we know it? Yeah, I mean, lots of ways to go with this. I'm just always struck also by the fact that we don't have extended collections of essays on what is Black studies methodology. But in disciplines, that's, of course, they're all out there, right? And maybe that's a good thing, because I like the idea of the multiplicity and undisciplined character of Black studies. But it's also this question, what is that thing that would survive even?
Yeah, I think that would be a big book. Or I think it would start out as a big book if we were to do that. And if we really kind of fine-tuned our definition of is it Black studies or not, then it might become a little bit smaller. But, that transdisciplinary nature that so many people talk about, past and present, I think is the key to undoing this world. Intellectually, and then therefore politically, metaphysically, so forth and so on. So I think that is definitely a key, that rigorous field of thought to service, but using multiple modalities and methods to do so is something you can't take away, I don't think.
I love that. Well, let me ask as a last question, and this puts you back at the center of the conversation. Thinking about Black studies, the field, its future, its present, what is the question you think we should all be asking, or what is the urgent thing you think we should all be thinking about?
So I'm going to give you, maybe I'll give you 2 or 3, if that's all right.
Sure, absolutely.
I'm going to put my administrative hat on here as chair, as director for, more than a decade in some years. And I would say that given the kind of reproliferation of Black studies, I think it might do us well, those of us invested in Black studies, to kind of tarry and deal with the questions and concerns that Vincent Harding brings up in his essay, New Creation or Familiar Death. Right. It's part of a kind of trilogy of essays that he writes about the Black university. And in it, again, I don't think we're paying enough attention to this. What could be the outcomes or the problems if we don't pay enough attention with the ways in which Black studies has been unhinged from the Black community, right? Unmoored from it and therefore relocated to places like Lewisburg, where I'm at, Amherst, where you were for many places, or what he says in the essay, he says Ithaca and Berkeley. And so I think we need to actually pay better attention to, is it actually ethical to have Black studies in places that don't have this intimate connection? I don't know the answer, but I don't think we spend enough time dealing with that anymore, because I think the logic could be somewhat similar. It's not identical. But when I read his essay, I'm thinking, would you do marine studies in Oklahoma? Especially if the community, as you started with, is central and core to Black studies. So I think we need to kind of revisit those types of questions that he gestures to. And I think related to that or not exclusive, is, what are we doing to ensure that departments, programs, and centers become institutionally indispensable, right? But have a high degree of autonomy and intellectual sovereignty. So if they are going to be part of the institution, how are they going to have some sovereignty and autonomy to do things? And I think lastly, what I would say is, I'm going to go back to Lerone Bennett and the challenge of Blackness and really say, are we acting as if everything is up for grabs, in this? And if everything's up for grabs, then there's not much to lose, right? At the end of the day. So those would be the things that I would want us to think about in a very general meta sense.
I love that. This is a really wonderful place to end. I mean, I'm always happy more than one thing to think about. Those are really interrelated too, but those are extremely difficult questions. But that last one about what if everything is up for grabs? What does that mean to us? Is for me really. As I said before, it's my first podcast of 2025 for the Black Studies podcast. A really fantastic way for me to reconnect to this series, because I think it's a question that makes you tremble a little bit, right? But tremble in all those sort of best biblical ways, right? When everything is up for grabs, this is a lot at stake. So,
True.
I love that. Thank you so much. I was really looking forward to this when we found time and scheduled time to meet and talk. And this has been even better than I anticipated. So I appreciate your time, but I really love your thoughtfulness in this conversation. Thank you so much for that, Khalil.
Hey, thanks a lot, John. Too generous, no doubt. And good luck in 2025 with the podcast.
Yeah. Well, good luck with all of your stuff in 2025 too. And for today, have a great rest of your day.
You too.
All right. Take
Peace.
care.